Section 3 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2. The Huguenots, Part 1. England had been for some considerable time the refuge of all those who felt Richelieu's galling yoke, and Buckingham, the favourite of King Charles I, was only too disposed to encourage their hopes and favour their designs against the cardinal. Sent in 1626 as ambassador to France, he had compromised Anne of Austria by pretending to be her lover, and things came to such a pass that war was inevitable. Buckingham, besides, expected thus to bring over to his side public opinion, which his extravagance and pretensions had alienated, and in the state of effervescence which had taken possession of England, he thought that a kind of crusade on behalf of the Huguenots would restore to him his popularity. The unfortunate marriage which had placed on the throne of England the Princess Henrietta Maria seemed to him a favourable opportunity of carrying out his purposes. It is no exaggeration to say that no political event had been more auspiciously designed and more inopportunely accomplished. The Duchesse de Chevreuse, appointed to accompany the young Queen to England, whose behaviour in London was of the most scandalous character, had become fascinated by Buckingham, and did her best to prejudice her husband against the unfortunate Henrietta Maria. That princess may have irritated, no doubt, Charles I by her haughtiness, her caprices, and her temper, but she was surrounded by snares of every kind, and the 3 ambassadors who had been sent over with her to France were utterly incapable of helping her to storm the tide of unpopularity which was rising on all sides. Of the Duc de Chevreuse we need say nothing. The 2 others, La Villauclair and Defeat, constantly at variance with each other, had neither energy enough to defend the interests of France, nor perspicacity enough to see through the intrigue so cleverly woven around them. To add to these complications, de Bérulle, the founder of the French oratory, and the only man of real ability mixed up with this affair, was disliked by Richelieu, and the vain Anne of Austria, still madly fond of Buckingham, took his part against her husband's own sister. In defiance of an express clause stipulated in the marriage contract of the Princess Henrietta Maria, all the French Catholic members of the household were dismissed and replaced by English servants. Privateers were secretly encouraged to give chase to French vessels, and all the prizes they managed to capture were considered as lawfully forfeited and sold. Bassompierre received orders to start immediately for England, for the purpose of remonstrating in the name of Louis XIII and obtaining full satisfaction. He was received with deference, assured that the legitimate complaints put forth by his master would be attended to, and Buckingham offered to come himself to Paris with the view of renewing the entente cordiale of which the marriage of the Princess Henrietta Maria was the pledge. This last proposition met not only with a refusal, but with an order absolutely prohibiting Buckingham from entering France. Under these circumstances, peace became impossible. The King of England openly expressed his intention of assisting actively the Huguenots, and Buckingham appeared before the island of Ré with a fleet of 90 ships, carrying an army of 16,000 men. Richelieu scarcely made a mystery of the satisfaction he felt on hearing the news. "The time has now arrived at last," said he, "of exterminating the Huguenot faction, which for upwards of a century has been rending France asunder. So long as the Huguenots have a footing in the country, the king will never be master at home, neither will he be able to carry on any glorious undertaking abroad. Finally, it will be impossible for him to tame the pride of the nobles, who still consider La Rochelle as a citadel under shelter of which they can assert with impunity their dissatisfactions and make good their supposed grievances. The energetic cardinal set about his military task with an amount of activity which was perfectly astonishing. Thanks to his indefatigable watchfulness, order and discipline were introduced throughout the army to an extent till then unknown. The soldiers, regularly paid, were no longer driven to seek their sustenance by pillage and marauding. The country districts supplied the troops with provisions. The neighbouring towns contributed articles of clothing and furniture. Richelieu, in his Memoirs, compares the camp before La Rochelle to a quiet, well-regulated monastery. The simile is all the more striking because a very large number of Franciscan monks had arrived in the train of the Prime Minister's confidential friend and adviser, Père Joseph, to perform the services of the Church and attend to the spiritual wants of the army. Richelieu's staff consisted chiefly of clergymen. Henry de Sourdis, Bishop of Maillezais, whom he promoted subsequently to the see of Bordeaux, the bishops of Nimes and of Mende, and the Abbé de Marcillac were his chief lieutenants, encouraging the soldiers, urging the workmen, and forwarding the preliminary operations with all possible diligence. The Rochellese, on their side, were preparing themselves for a desperate resistance. They had elected as their mayor an intrepid sailor, Guiton, who, drawing his dagger, exclaimed, "I accept the honour you are pleased to confer upon me, but on condition that this dagger shall serve to pierce the heart of whosoever dares speak of surrendering, mine foremost, if I should be unhappy enough to stoop to such an act of cowardice." The English were driven from the island of Ré, where they had managed to land, and in order to prevent them from victualling La Rochelle, the cardinal erected a gigantic dyke, 740 toises long, 12 toises wide at its basis, and 4 at the top, and rising above the highest tides. 2 fortresses protected the extremities, whilst 200 vessels served as a defence to the neighbouring coast. On the side of the land, a line of circumvallation 9 miles long, covered by 13 forts besides 18 redoubts, and bristling with artillery, held the town within a circle of fire, and cut off all communications between the Rochellese and the interior of the country. Louis XIII. Had been induced by his minister to come himself and watch the operations of the siege. After a short stay he returned to Paris, and Richelieu was left in chief command, having under him the Dukes of Angoulême and d'Epernon, and Marshals Schomberg and Bassompierre. Reduced to live upon shellfish, grass, and refuse of every kind, the Rochellese seemed utterly lost. Dissensions were beginning to break out, but whilst some disheartened persons urged submission, whilst quarrels took place in the council and riots in the streets, the champions of liberty, headed by the inflexible Guiton and the heroic Duchesse de Rohan, were determined upon waiting for the fresh assistance which Charles I. had promised them. The women, the children, and the aged, turned out of the city by the besieged, driven back by the besiegers, perished between the two armies. Upwards of 16,000 of the inhabitants had been carried off by hunger, and yet the survivors remained unflinching in their resolution to hold out. Ponty relates in his Memoirs that on being told that everyone was dying, Guiton coolly answered, "Provided one remains to shut the gates, it is enough." On the 22nd of September, the English fleet, commanded by Lord Lindsay, at last appeared in sight, but after several fruitless efforts it was compelled to retire, and a little more than a month later, October 29th, 1628, the Rochellese capitulated. They had kept Richelieu in check for the space of 15 months, and the political unity of France had cost 40 millions of livres. a state paper drawn up in the form of a letter of pardon granted to the inhabitants a complete amnesty, together with freedom of worship. On the 30th of October Richelieu took possession of La Rochelle, and the next day he celebrated Mass in the church of Sainte Marguerite. Squares, streets, houses were crowded with corpses. 12,000 loaves of bread were distributed amongst the people, and after the most urgent cases of relief had been met, the political work began. Externally, says M. Gardiner, La Rochelle was treated like a conquered city. The massive walls which had bid defiance to so many armies were destroyed. The privileges of the town were cancelled, and the king's officers governed the Protestant municipal republic as they governed in Paris or in Rouen. But Richelieu had set his heart on showing to the world an example of toleration, and his influence with Louis was great enough to enable him to have his way. He at least was no dreamer, and he knew that if France was to be strong against its enemies without, it must be at peace at home. Those who expected that the victory of a cardinal would be the signal for outrages against the Huguenots found that they were grievously mistaken. Wherever the French Protestants had enjoyed liberty of worship before, they were to enjoy it now. Protestant and Catholic would be equally welcome to aid their common country with their services. But there was to be no more political independence, no more defiance of the sovereign, who represented in the eyes of all men the unity of France. The Edit de Grasse, issued at Nîmes in July 1629, as the result of the new state of things, was for the Huguenots as the commencement of a fresh era. Deprived of their political influence, they directed their whole attention toward the arts of peace, and obtained soon a decided superiority over their fellow countrymen in commerce, agriculture, and industry. Richelieu, on his side, always scrupulously observed the conditions of the treaty, and, except in a few cases, showed himself just and kind towards the Protestants. Thus, in 1631, during the course of a national synod held at Charenton, September 1st to October 10th, he allowed them to settle a good number of administrative details relating to the schools, the relief of the poor, church discipline, relations with the Lutherans, etc. He replied to the deputies of the Assembly that his intention was to maintain what had been granted to them and authorize what should not be contrary to previous edicts. This synod, before breaking up, received the thanks of the minister for the spirit which had marked its proceedings, and the expenses it had incurred were defrayed by a grant from His Majesty's exchequer. The government, as a kind of return, obtained the free appointment of the deputies general to the synods, and the members of these ecclesiastical convocations gave up the right of presenting 6 candidates for the deputation. They merely reserved to themselves the privilege of approving the 2 names suggested by the king, and which, thus selected and recommended, would afterwards receive the royal nomination. A considerable number of Huguenot gentilshommes were employed by Richelieu in the army, where they rendered the greatest services to France. Let us name only Gassion, Rantzau, the Duc de la Force, the Duc de Rohan, Turenne, and Duquesne. The Prince de Condé himself acknowledged that the success of the Battle of Rocroi was entirely due to Gassion, who received the staff of Marshal of France shortly after, and who by his modesty, his activity, and his integrity increased the well-deserved reputation he had acquired as a soldier. The slightest deviation from the truth, even if the result of politeness, was repugnant to his essentially upright character. "I will not receive any compliments from my friends," he used to say, "and they must not expect any from me." One day Cardinal Richelieu, having endeavoured to secure his co-operation in the carrying out of some intrigue, Gassion answered, "My lord, you may reckon upon my life and my death whenever I shall be called upon to serve you, but give me the opportunity of doing so, without having to assist in any underhand plot. I shall give you a good account of your enemies, but they must also be mine." "That is sufficient, sir," answered the cardinal. "Your fortune may be the worse in consequence of your resolution, but my esteem for you remains the same." Of Marshal Rantzau, who had received 60 wounds and lost one eye, one arm, and one leg in the French service, it was proverbially said that his heart was the one part of his person which had remained untouched. The Duc de la Force distinguished himself equally in the wars of the early 17th century. He won the battle of Carignan over the Spaniards, and defeated the Duc de Lorraine at Montbéliard, when the cavalry of Jean de Werth, after having taken Corbie, 1636, threatened Paris. He organised the traders, artisans, and even the street porters, crocheteurs, into an army and saved the capital. The Duc de Rohan is well known, and we have alluded to him before. Sentenced to exile in 1629, restored subsequently to favour, he took possession of the Valtelline in 1635. Then, once more disgraced, he served as a volunteer in the army of the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, and was mortally wounded at the battle of Rheinfeld. Turenne, it is true, abjured Protestantism during the reign of Louis XIV. But he belonged to the Huguenots at the time when he earned his first distinction as a military man. Duquesne, on the other hand, remained to the end of his life firm in his religious belief. He began his naval career in the fleet commanded by the Archbishop of Bordeaux. He was only 17 when he signally contributed to the expedition which ended in the driving of the Spaniards from the islands of Lerins. He distinguished himself in the engagement at Tarragona, 1641, and at that of Cape Gata, 1643, where he was wounded. Let us end this catalogue by mentioning the name of Marshal de Chatillon, who won the battle of Avesnes in the Netherlands, and took possession of Hesdin and Arras. Grandson of Admiral Coligny, Gaspard, Count de Chatillon, although a Protestant, played very little part in the affairs of his church, and in the struggle it had to carry on with the royal authority. He was naturally of an indolent disposition, disliked business, and had felt annoyed both by the airs of superiority which the Duc de Rohan affected towards him, and by the violent attacks which the more fanatic amongst his fellow religionists directed against him. It was only after the siege of La Rochelle that he obtained an important command in the French army. He died in 1646. End of section 3.